Hello, everybody. Welcome to our K-3 year-long journey. Today, we're going to be doing an introduction to the science of reading for our year-long journey. But before we get started, I want to introduce all the facilitators that you're going to be hearing from today on the meeting. So let's first jump to McKinney.
Hello, everyone. Nice to meet everyone. My name is McKinney Coleman, and I work at the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy. I'm a content creator, which means that I develop a lot of the courses that are in the K-3 space for Cox Campus. I've had 20 years in education. I've taught kindergarten and first grade, and I was a reading coach for grades K through 5. And now I said I'm at Rollins. And some of the things that I just love doing and why I love this job is because I love training teachers. I have a passion for that. I have a passion for teaching students how to read, and this kind of like melded everything together. And in my free time, I love spending time with my friends and family, watching movies and going out to eat. I love to eat. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the next facilitator, which is, I believe it's Sally.
Hey, I'm Sally Edwards, and this is actually my 23rd year in education. I have done a little bit of everything. I've been a classroom teacher, an interventionist, academic coach, RTI coordinator, district literacy coach. And I've been with Rollins in the past and have recently returned, and I'm so excited to be back to share my passion for the science of reading and making sure that all children learn to read and have access to equitable reading instruction. And in my free time, I like to cook and garden, and we are mid-restoration of an 88-year-old house. So we are busy with that, but we're so excited to have everybody here with us today. And I think next is Alistair.
Thank you, Sally. I have held a few different roles in education, but before coming to Cox Campus as a content course creator, I worked with students who have dyslexia and other language-based reading disabilities, and in the K through 5 space. And from there, I came to Cox Campus, and now, as McKinney and Sally mentioned, work on some of the courses that you can see on Cox Campus. In my free time, I enjoy hiking with my dog and reading, spending times with friends and family, and spending time with my daughter. So let's go ahead, and before we begin, we've introduced ourselves, but we would like to hear from you guys. So if you will rename yourself in Zoom. If you look on our slide, we have some directions for that, but you can go to the bottom and rename yourself with your grade and your name. And then I know some people have already done it in the chat, but if you would introduce yourself and where you are from and your role, just so that we can get an idea of who is here today and what different roles in education that we're in, that would be great. So rename yourself and then share where you're from and your role. All right, I see Anna Mary, and she's a director of language arts and literacy for K-5. ELA specialist, a K through 5 instructional coach, preschool director. Awesome. And a district literacy coach. So lots of coaching and another instructional coach. That's great. All right, so let me go ahead and take us to the next slide. In the chat, would you just give a thumbs up if you've ever heard of Cox Campus before? So if you don't know, let me quickly give background from where it all started. Oh, yay, it looks like we have some familiar Cox Campus people with us. So the Atlanta Speech School is a comprehensive language and literacy school with programs that are rooted in research-based practices and brain science. In 2004, the Rollins Center for Language and Literacy was founded to share these practices with the community through in-person professional development on site and also our online learning platform, Cox Campus. So Cox Campus really helps us bring this approach to a larger audience. And we partner with leaders in the areas of science and reading and child development to inform the courses that we offer online. And it looks like many of you are familiar with Cox Campus. So quickly, we're going to send a link to a poll where it's just going to ask you if you're a Cox Campus member and what best describes your role. And I see we have some people that are new to Cox Campus too, which is great. Great, I see that we have some students who love everything about Cox Campus. So Cox Campus is completely free and it's always accessible, all of our courses, all of our resources. And if you're not a member of Cox Campus already, you're able to sign up from your phones, and we'll drop a website link in the chat for you. And we'd love to have you join us on Cox Campus. So today in our session, we're going to be going over in the year-long journey an introduction to the science of reading. So we're going to preview what to expect. We'll also preview what to expect in our year-long journey, gain an understanding of the development of the deep reading brain and the skills that educators need to teach students based on the science of reading. We'll also preview Cox Campus for those of you that aren't familiar with it yet, so that you can see the online community that we have for our educators and leaders and all the tools that you can find on Cox Campus. And then quickly, we're going to review our session norms. And for our session norms today, we just ask that everyone listen with an open mind, participate and share ideas, and most importantly, that we just have fun. So just to introduce for the year-long journey some of the topics that we are going to be covering, we're going to be doing a deep dive into phonemic awareness and phonics. And these topics are discussed in 2 of our courses at length, which McKinney is going to talk about a little bit later on.
All right, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and start diving in. But first, I want you to look at this quote from Marianne Wolf, which states, "Human beings were never born to read." And I just want you to take some time to reflect on that. And what I would love for you to do is to answer, respond in the chat. What does that statement mean to you? What does that statement mean? Human beings were never born to read. And in a second, I may ask a brave soul, just 1 or 2 brave souls to share. So you can share either in the chat, and then in a second, I may, I see that, Latanya. That's my favorite emoji. That's one of my favorite emojis. And, and I may call on a couple of people just to respond. Okay, so I'll give you some time to think about it. Okay, I already see some great responses coming through. Does any brave soul want to come off mute and just share either what you already shared in the chat or something, something new? As you're thinking about that, if anyone wants to come out, I'm just going to read a couple of these. So someone said, it means we must explicitly teach reading. Someone said humans have been around long before printed language. Someone said because reading, I'm scrolling too fast, because reading evolved as humans needed a means to save information in places other than their brains. Okay, I love these responses, and I'm going to go ahead and continue, but I'm going to ask somebody for something else later on, okay? All right, so let's go to the next slide. So thinking about what some of you have said, let's talk about this. So human beings learn to read without having a specific reading center in the brain. Okay, so from birth, our brains are hardwired already for language, to speak just like I'm doing right now, right? But not to read it. So if you look at the area in the brain, it's kind of like dark gray around. It says the inferior frontal gyrus. This is called the Broca's area. Okay, and this area in our brain helps us to articulate speech sounds and to speak, like I'm doing right now again. Okay, and then the area of the brain where you see the superior temporal region helps us to decipher the speech that we hear. So for example, if Sally was talking to me, then I'll understand what she's saying, okay, and able to comprehend it. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So as babies, we heard our families talk around, next slide. As babies, we heard our families talk around us and we analyzed what we heard, right? And we created a preference for the phonemes or individual sounds of our own home language, right? So this process enhances babies' brains with language. So if our brains are hardwired for language when we are born, then how do we learn to read? So somebody already kind of said it in the chat earlier. Okay, reading is, and we can go to the next slide. Reading is a cultural invention. So humans invented writing as a way to communicate with each other and to hold information and maybe pass it on, right? It just makes it easier, right? Instead of keep saying the same thing over and over again. We may lose what we eventually are saying, like a game of telephone, right? You start here and then you end, and then it's something totally different. So if we're writing something down, we can see the way we intended it to be. So since reading and writing, since reading and written language became an important part of societies, our brains had to adapt. And we can go to the next slide. So unlocking meaning in a string of symbols requires complex neural circuitry, right? So unlike for language, our brains didn't have, again, like I said earlier, dedicated regions in the brain for reading. So our brains are magnificent, and they were able to rearrange the different circuits so that now we have new connections, so that we can rearrange new connections, form new connections, and also recycle and repurpose parts of the brain. So I like to think of this as kind of, Frankenstein the monster, how all the parts were put together and made Frankenstein. So it's kind of like that, right? So it's like a Frankenstein circuit, and we're going to refer to it as the reading brain circuit. So just to recap, we're able to have a new circuit dedicated to reading by using parts of the brain that are originally made for vision, language, and cognition. We'll go to the next slide. So one thing to keep in mind is that every reader must create a new reading brain circuit. And so whether you are 7, 17, or 70, we all learn how to read the same way. Okay, and this is why structured literacy works for everyone, and that's great news. So now let's just take a moment to appreciate how intricate the reading brain is, and we're going to do a quick little activity to see that, and I'm going to hand it over to Sally.
Okay, so before we start labeling our brains, we had a technical glitch earlier, and we're going to launch the poll now where you can introduce yourself. So we'll give you just a few minutes to complete that. Oh, it's still not working. So we're going to move ahead to the next slide and talk about our reading brains. Okay, so for this activity, you're going to need a pen or a marker and your right fist. So if you are left-handed, this is your time to shine. If you are right-handed like me, this may be a little awkward, okay? The reason we're going to mark our brains on our right hands is because reading occurs in the language centers of the brain. The circuitry happens on the left hemisphere. So we're going to mark our fists on the left hemisphere. So when we first encounter a word in a text or on a screen, it comes into the occipital lobe of the brain, which is in the back. So we're going to do a little dot right here on your fist. That's your occipital lobe. And this represents the orthographic processor, where we see letters. If you're familiar with Seidenberg's 4-part processor, this is the part we're talking about. And this is your occipital lobe. So everybody, I hope you're labeling along with me. All right, so now that we've seen the letters, we have to figure out what sounds those letters represent so that we can figure out what the word is. So we're going to go to our knuckle up here, do another dot. This is very awkward with my left hand, but we're going to do another dot. This is that Broca's area that McKinney was speaking about earlier. This is in the prefrontal cortex, in the frontal lobe, and this is your phonological processor. This is where you process sounds. So if I was speaking, you would be processing the sounds up here in the front part of the brain. Now we have to put those things together, and we're going to go up into the parietal lobe up here on this knuckle. This is where your graphemes, the letters, and the phonemes, the sounds, are all decoded. This is our decoding processor. And then now that we've decoded it and we know what's happening, and y'all, all of this happens within milliseconds of each other, we're going to go down to the bottom. And this is in our temporal lobe. And this is the meaning processor. This is where our brains evaluate whether or not that word makes sense in the context that we're using it in. So the meaning processor and the context processor, if you're familiar with Seidenberg's 4-part processor. And I think Alex is going to drop a link. If you are interested in learning more about the reading brain, there's a link to a video from a researcher named Stanislaus Dehaene that talks about the brain and how it actually learns to read. All right, and now we're going to pass it off to Alistair, and she's going to talk about the introduction to the science of reading.
So we started this presentation with some of these kind of, dense scientific frameworks because it really helps us to understand how the reading brain is constructed from birth all the way through literacy and learning to read and developing as a reader. Understanding them also has really practical implications for how we're teaching reading. It includes the types of diagnostic assessments we need to be giving to students and how we're going to differentiate instruction for our readers. So on our next slide, it talks a little bit about what the science of reading is not. I know that we've heard that term thrown out a lot. And the science of reading is not an ideology or philosophy. It's not a fad or a trend, a new idea. A political agenda, a one-size-fits-all approach, a program of instruction, a single specific component of instruction, such as phonics. So now that we've talked about all the things that science of reading is not, let's look at what the science of reading is. And on the screen, I'm going to show a passage that talks a little bit about the science of reading, and it's a little bit longer. So I want you guys to just take a minute and read it yourself. And there's a lot of terms thrown out in this passage. So I want you to, after you read it, just pick out a few of the terms that really stand out to you. And if you would type them in the chat, and I might ask another brave soul if they want to go off mute and share what they have, and I can call out some of your responses. So as you're looking at this passage, again, just highlight some of those salient words and phrases that stand out to you about the science of reading. So we have effectively assess, a vast amount of evidence. There's evidence backing the science of reading. Improve student outcomes. We see that student outcomes are improved when we implement the science of reading in the classroom. Proficient reading and writing. I love that Alicia mentioned that we can't forget the writing aspect of it. We keep saying science of reading, and we know that reading and writing feed off of each other. the research data derived that Monica mentioned, it's just so critical to, that's why we say the science of reading. It's backed by research and data, science-based, all over the world in multiple languages. And it's an overall understanding of why some children find it difficult to read, and then explicit and science-based ways to. And Sally mentioned, I got distracted. Sally mentioned we have a new writing course in our Science of Reading suite. So please check that out on Cox campus. Vast interdisciplinary body of scientifically based research, thousands of studies. So I feel like a lot of these words are just reiterating that scientific base, that evidence is backing it, and that we know it's effective. We know the outcomes are improved when we implement the science of reading. So I'm going to go ahead and take us to the next slide that just talks a little bit about the recommendations from the National Reading Panel. And I'm sure you're probably familiar with these 5 pillars of reading and the instructional recommendations that the National Reading Panel came out with in 2001. And they determined that these 5 elements, phonological awareness, vocabulary, comprehension, phonics, and fluency, must be intentionally and explicitly taught in order for children to become proficient readers. Since the publication of this report came out, the science of reading and evidence-based practices that are consistent with it continue to be debated by practitioners. And sometimes this is referred to as the reading wars, if that is familiar with any of you, which oversimplified is just saying that the reading wars is kind of this ongoing debate between those who believe and support a whole language approach to reading, which is characterized a little bit more by incidental teaching, and compared with those who believe and support that structured literacy approach to reading. Obviously, this debate has inevitably impacted our reading instruction and the instruction that our students are receiving in the classroom, which does have far-reaching implications for our pre-service teacher ed programs and just honestly ongoing professional learning. So the science of reading is really coming back to the decades of research that we've had and the evidence that shows that a majority of students do require the structured literacy approach in order to be able to develop the skills that they need to read proficiently. This includes students from lower SES backgrounds, students that are learning English as a second or third language, students that were previously diagnosed with oral language delays, students with low language proficiency, reading disabilities, the list goes on, that this is the most effective form of teaching. And all students can benefit from structured literacy, which I think is also really important, that every student is going to get something from having more of a structured literacy approach. In this recommendation from the National Reading Panel, they define explicit as the explanation and modeling of key skills, explicitly pointing it out to students. They're not expected to develop them on their own exposure or incidental learning opportunities. Also, that instruction would be systematic, which I'm sure you all are probably familiar with, but that it's a sequence of instruction. So, for example, children are taught to decode vowel consonant words and then consonant vowel consonant words before they're learning to read multisyllabic words, that there's a system behind the way you're introducing concepts. Also, structured literacy is more effective because if we want all of our children to be successful readers, we have to abandon all of these strategies that aren't really aligned with the research. So let's explore a few of the key theoretical frameworks that underpin the science of reading in practice. And we can go to the next slide.
Sorry, I wasn't off mute. Before we jump into the frameworks, I'm going to talk a little bit about the data behind why the structured literacy approach is so important. So we can go to the next slide. All right, so I have a feeling that this is not going to be a surprise to most people on the call. We know that we have like a national epidemic of illiteracy. and that only 35% of our children in 4th grade were reading on grade level, according to the NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Educational Progress. This is pre-pandemic information, and so I think we could all predict that things are not going to look a whole lot better after post-pandemic. But from what you know, if you are familiar with MTSS or RTI, those, when we look at that kind of data, we think about 80% of our children should be reading on grade level. According to Louisa Moats, we can teach actually more than that percentage of children can learn to read. So I'm curious if anybody knows that number, what Moats says we can actually teach, what percentage of children can actually learn to read. And if you want to post that in the chat, I'm curious. Yep, Paula got it. 95% of children can learn to read when taught with a structured literacy approach. And right now, if you look at where we are as a nation, only 35% are reading proficiently. So let's look at the next slide and talk about what that means. So none of our children are doing very well. But this slide really indicates the achievement gap. If you look at the numbers for white children compared to Black and Hispanic children, you can see that these groups are disproportionately impacted. And this chart doesn't show it, but English learners, low socioeconomic status, these are all groups that are struggling when we look at what we're currently doing. Let's look at the next slide and talk a little bit about graduation rates and what the comparison between reading, because a lot of times we see that our graduation rates are going up and we think, okay, well, we're doing all right as a country. In 2019, so again, pre-pandemic, only 37% of students in the 12th grade were reading proficiently, but 86% of them graduated from high school. And so we bring this up just to say that we are actually graduating children who are not reading proficiently, and something has to change. So let's look at the next slide, just kind of as a recap of where we are. 35% of 4th graders are not reading proficiently. Only 5% of teachers report that they were taught how to teach reading in college. 75% of teachers report using 3Qing, which is a method that promotes using strategies other than decoding words to read. And the most widely used curriculums in our country are actually in opposition of the science of reading. So our data tells us that we need to do something differently. And the science of reading and all of the topics that we're going to talk about this year during our year-long journey at Cox campus are all going to make it so that Tier 1 instruction is more accessible for all students, because all students deserve to be able to be proficient readers. And now we're going to jump into those theoretical frameworks, and we're going to let McKinney talk for just a few minutes.
All right, thanks, Sally. So the first framework we're going to look at is called the simple view of reading, and I'm sure some of you have heard of this before, but if not, I'm just going to talk about it for a little bit. So the simple view of reading is a framework that explains the core factors that contribute to skilled reading comprehension, which you see in that pink bubble. So let's look at the green bubble first, which is decoding. So decoding is the ability to apply letter sound and letter pattern knowledge to correctly pronounce written words. And it's basically the ability to read the print on the page. And then let's look at that yellow bubble. And that stands for language comprehension. And it's the ability to understand spoken word. And again, as we look at the pink bubble, that's the ability to understand print. So the ability to understand what was read in that green bubble. Okay, so this formula presents reading comprehension as a product and not the sum of. So basically, it illustrates that you need both decoding and language comprehension for reading comprehension to be present. And if either of those factors is 0, then reading comprehension is going to be 0. And so having strong language skills only or having strong decoding skills only will not yield a skilled reader. And a reading profile that presents weakness in either one of those domains will prevent students from being able to read proficiently. So we're going to do a little activity, and we go to the next slide. And I'm going to show you a couple of normal activities that you may see in the classroom. And you're going to use what I just told you about in the simple view of reading. And you're going to determine whether that activity is purely a decoding skill is being developed or purely a language comprehension skill is being developed. And what I want you to do is I want you to type your response in the chat. And just remember again, decoding is the ability to read print on the page, and language comprehension is the ability to understand spoken word. Okay, so let's look at this first example. Okay, so Miss Ali asks her students to make a personal connection to a character in a read aloud. So I want you to put in the chat, okay, and you can just put D or L just to make it so you don't have to keep typing it long words. So you can put decoding or language comprehension. Okay, so I see a lot of L's. I think I saw a D. Okay, so I would love for somebody to come off the chat. I mean, it come off and tell me, why did you put L? Because I see a lot of L's. And that is the correct answer. I'll just let you know. So why did you put L? Why did you put language comprehension?
I put language comprehension because there's no print involved.
There you go. It was a read aloud, right? So it's just the teacher is doing a read aloud and ask a student a question. Great, thank you for sharing. All right, so let's move to the next one. All right, Ms. Davis asked her students to change the first letter in a word and then read it. What do y'all think? Yep, okay, it is decoding. All right, let's look at the next one. Using his assessment data, Mr. Smith reviews vowel patterns by having his students dictate words. What do you think that is? Okay, so I see some D's and some L's. Okay, so can anyone tell me why they put D and L? Or can somebody tell me why they put D? Anybody want to share? I promise I'm not gonna get you. I promise.
This is Monica. I chose what I did because of the it goes back to the foundational letter, the sounds of the letter, and just knowing the basics with the print motivation. I could be wrong, but to me, it goes back to the foundation, the skills of learning to read.
Okay, so I will say we put decoding for this because this is really like decoding and encoding happening, because he's telling the word, right? And they're having to go ahead and write the word. But I will say, if we go super deep, right? They had to hear those sounds,
The
right?
sound, yeah.
So I will accept the D and the L for the way you presented that answer. Okay.
I think the problem is that Mr. Smith is having his students dictate the words. I think what you need to say is Mr. Smith is dictating the words and having his students spell them. That was my confusion.
Oh, that's right. You know what? You are absolutely correct. You're right. Yep, you're right. Because the activity is like he's telling them, yes. So he's telling them the words.
They're not spelling words. It doesn't say that they're spelling words, right? It just says by students dictating the words using decoding skills for those vowel patterns. Like if you saw the two vowels together, they know how to decode that based on what they know about how vowels work.
Say that one more time.
So if they're looking at vowel patterns, like he's looking at their vowel pattern usage and using an assessment that he's given them, the students are decoding based on or they're decoding writing words or
They're writing
or
words.
saying the words. Yeah. Based
Mhm.
on how they know how vowels work, if they're doing like, how vowels work, I guess.
Right. So they're hearing him say the word, he's saying the word. So for example, let's say if he said the word, like I'm just making up something, he said the word cake, right? Let's say they're working on A-E, right? He said the word cake. So they having to, and he saw that they, by the assessment, that was something that they were having a problem with. And they're writing the word cake. So they had to hear him say the word, right? So they had to process what he said. And then they're having to decode, not decode, they're having to encode the word
Right.
that he's saying.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm saying, if we're talking about the part where we're saying like, it could be language comprehension because they had to hear those sounds, right? Hear that, and then transfer it into what they have to actually encode.
But
Yeah,
do they have to understand what cake is to write the word cake?
No.
No. So how is
No.
that comprehending a word? Like that's where I get confused. Like
Oh,
what
okay.
comprehension does that have to, and I could be looking at this completely incorrectly,
Mhm.
but
Mhm.
if you're just working on saying and spelling a word, you might not necessarily need to know what a cake is.
Exactly. The key for me here is the hearing part of it, and the fact that you're playing with it, reviewing the vowel pattern where the student dictate to me that, that there was a playful aspect when I work with younger kids. So I'm thinking of the phonetical awareness that you hear it and then you start making those, the rhyming words, and you start changing. So I was using that as my foundation.
Yeah.
Right. And I know there's recent research to say that there's a link also between vocabulary and hearing those sounds. And that might be getting a little too deep right here, but I know there's new. that's why I was saying, like, if we want to go that way, we could. If we're going that way,
but isn't that isn't that the 3 cueing system then?
No,
like, that's why, like, if you're, because if you're checking for a picture, that's where my mind goes right too. So
I'm not.
That's okay. Go, you go.
Yeah, I'm saying more so with like the 4-part processor, when you're like, and anybody could jump in with me if I'm saying this correctly, but I'm just saying, like, if there's been some research around the connection between like vocabulary words and here, I'm not talking about the cueing system of like trying to remember the word because it's associated.
You're saying like if they know the meaning, like if they know the meaning of the word, they'll be able to write it
when you get
better?
into fluent. Yeah, when you are talking about like fluency with the word.
That makes
And
sense.
but yeah, that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm trying to
No.
I
think this is a good conversation.
Yeah.
I think this is a good conversation. I think I was just getting a little deeper than.
No, it's good. It's so good. I work with an early learning and school readiness in Gwinnett County, and so like this knowledge is something I need, girl. You give it all the things.
Right. Okay, so let's go to for time's sake, let's just do one more because I know we only got 20 minutes left. So let's just do one more real quick. But I think that was a great conversation. It doesn't bother me. Okay, next. All right, after Mr. Lee reads a section of a nonfiction text about spiders, he asks his students to turn and talk about what they learned. Okay, we got that one. That is just language. Okay, so we can skip the next one so we can have time with Scarborough's rope. Oh, real quick, let me just say this. Okay, so for when we're talking about the simple view of reading, we have some courses that are on Cox campus that kind of fall into those underneath the different categories. So if we are looking at decoding, we have an early literacy course that is not only it's talking about print awareness, phonological awareness, and alphabet knowledge. We also have a phonics course. And then if we're looking at language, we have a course on read alouds. So we put this under language comprehension because, again, this is the teacher reading out loud for students and asking questions and enhancing vocabulary. And then coming soon, we have oral language, vocabulary, and comprehension. And then we have reading fluency in the middle because that is kind of tying everything together.
So McKinney did a great job explaining the simple view of reading. And I'm going to kind of take the simple view of reading and apply it to another framework, Scarborough's reading rope. So in the simple view of reading, we were listing if it was language comprehension or if it was decoding. And when we look at Scarborough's reading rope, it in some ways plays to that simple view of reading, but expands it a little bit more. So Hollis Scarborough actually developed this in the 1990s as a way of explaining what factors are comprised in skilled proficient reading, and it teases it apart a little bit more. So for example, as an educator in a classroom, you may be familiar with this graphic, but it's really helpful in pinpointing areas of weakness and being able to say, all right, you know, my student is able to decode, but an area of weakness might be the vocabulary knowledge, just to be able to pinpoint even to the next level the different factors that are involved. So it's a useful tool for parents and educators. It's a tool that you can explain to parents the practices you're doing in the classroom and the why behind it. But all of the components are interconnected and interdependent. So you'll see on the left that all the different factors are listed out. They're part of a strand. The strands are woven together, and it takes all of those things to become a skilled reader. And when we're looking at the rope, I'm going to start at the bottom section, that decoding word recognition piece, because I think a lot of times these are the pieces that may come to our mind when we think about teaching our young students how to read. When we're talking about, you know, those basic level word recognition pieces, and some of them we just kind of highlighted in our points with the simple view. But the first one that we have listed under word recognition is phonological awareness. So in very, you know, broad terms, phonological awareness is just understanding that words are made up of sounds. So in order to read, readers need to recognize the sounds that they make with their mouths are connected or correspond with the words that they see on a page. So this is a very early but instrumental skill that sets the stage for everything that follows. And then under phonological awareness, another sub-skill they have is decoding, which they also connect with spelling or encoding. And decoding is oftentimes what we think of when we see beginning readers. So it's going to be students sounding out words. It includes all our phonics skills and mapping sounds onto letters. And so when a student is proficient in decoding, they can read the words on a page. They may not connect it to the meaning, but they're able to sound out the words on the page and apply those rules and sound symbol correspondence. And then that last skill is sight recognition. So the words that we have automatically stored through orthographic mapping that can be quickly and efficiently received by students as they're reading on the page. Then we're going to jump up to those top strands for listening comprehension, the upper components of the rope. And as he expands on these different factors, we know that word recognition alone is not enough for skilled reading. So I'm sure all of us have had that experience with a reader who can call out words on a page, but isn't going to the next level to access the meaning behind it. And fluent readers, skilled readers, understand the text they're reading as a whole, where they're drawing conclusions, they're finding important takeaways, they're constructing meaning as they read. And the upper strands of the rope are key in having that strong reader that's comprehending what they're reading. A lot of these strands can be started before formal schooling because it's that part of your brain that's primed for language and understanding language. So even though those early years get the focus on those bottom skills, we know that we need the language comprehension skills and we need them to continue to formally develop. The first skill that we see is background knowledge, and that is kind of a broad general knowledge base, the facts, the concepts that the student is bringing when they're reading the words on a page. Then we have vocabulary knowledge, which is the breadth and depth of known word meanings. Language structures, which is essentially talking about the form and the rules to language. So we're talking about syntax, which is the order of our words, and also kind of overlapping with grammar and the rules behind it, and then semantics, which is the meaning of text. English has a ton of rules and patterns and orders that students have to be familiar with and understand. So that awareness of the structure behind language, the syntax and the semantics, and that the way that words are ordered can affect meaning and understanding that. Then we have verbal reasoning, which is a lot of those inferencing skills and problem-solving skills, being able to decipher figurative language and metaphors. And then at the bottom, we have that knowledge of literacy. So here we're talking a lot about print concepts and genres, that familiarity with different genres of print, and just the overall knowledge base for literacy and approaching the text. Probably should have given y'all a little warning in the beginning, but maybe this will make it more fun. We're actually going to attach a link in the chat, and it's going to send you to a Jamboard link where you're going to try to sort, similar to kind of how you just did with the scenarios, the links to the different skills. So is the skill a language comprehension skill, or is it a decoding skill? And we'll just briefly do this for the sake of time. But if you click that link in the chat and just take a minute to try to see if you can sort them based on the conversation we've had here. And there is a slide next to it where you can check your responses, but try to do it first before you check your answer. So I'm just going to give us a little bit of time to start. All right, so just briefly in the chat, were you able to sort when you're reflecting on all the different skills? Were you surprised by your ability to sort them into each of the categories of the reading rope? Was it easier than you thought it would be, more difficult than you thought it would be? And we'll just take a second for this because I know we need to move to the next slide. All right, so some were saying when the words were given, it was easy to sort. All right, we're going to go ahead and skip to this slide that we have up now with a quote from Marianne Wolf that says, "We read to become who we are meant to be." So we just went over a lot of the dense frameworks and the science behind reading and how the reading brain works, but we also want to talk about the deep reading brain. So we know there's more to reading than just reading the words on the page. And at Rollins and Cox Campus, we really believe in going beyond just proficiency and learning how to read for children to actually becoming deep readers and thinkers. So being able to pull together what you know about the word and the world and think beyond the author to generate our own thoughts. And on our next slide, we have listed out a few of those deep reading brain processes. So we have, we know it goes beyond just seeing the words on the page. It's actually very sophisticated processes that drive that comprehension and construction of meaning as students are reading words on the page. And we want our students to be engaged in deep reading because this develops and strengthens their capacity in areas like critical thinking, empathy, where they're able to understand and share feelings of another. And it really deepens their takeaways from when they're constructing meaning in print. On our next slide, we list we're going to talk about the different parts that make up a thriving ecosystem for the deep reading brain. We can use the acronym PEACE to help us remember each component. So that first letter P stands for personal reflection. And I stands for imagination. E stands for empathy. C stands for critical thinking. And E stands for executive function. So all of these are important pieces of the ecosystem as we're creating that deep reading brain for students. And when we're putting together curriculum and engaging in activities in the classroom, we want that ecosystem that promotes the deep reading brain and helps it to develop and thrive in our classrooms. So now I think we're going to briefly go to talk about our Cox campus and give you a tour of the Cox campus, and McKinney's going to walk us through that really quickly.
All right, so let me share my screen. All right, can everyone see Cox campus? Let me know with a thumbs up or yes if the screen changed from the PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay. All right, so this is Cox Campus, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you very quickly how you can search for things that you may want to see. And I know the next sessions are going to be centered around phonemic awareness. So let's use that as an example, right? So let's say you want to know, oh, and let me just say the Cox Campus there, like I look at it as like 4 major areas that you can like really dive into. One is the coursework. Second is our resources. Third is our blog posts, and fourth is our live events, like just this one today, right? So let's start with courses, right? So if I'm looking for K-3 courses that I wanted to look at more, you go to educators, kindergarten through third grade, and these are all our kindergarten through third grade courses. And then here you will see our course that I was talking about earlier, that is on print awareness, phonological awareness, and alphabet knowledge. Okay, now let's see, there's two ways you can look at resources. So let's come here, I'm gonna click on the actual course. And let's say I wanted to just see resources specific to this course. I'll just click resources, and here you'll see different resources that are associated with that topic. So you just see different things like print awareness questions, voice and unvoiced consonants, just different things you can use. But let's say I didn't want to look that way. I just wanted to search like the entire site for phonemic awareness. So what I could do there is I'm going to go back to, I'm going to click resource library, and then I'm going to put in, okay, phonemic awareness. And then we should see at the bottom, you'll see some resources that came up: phonemic awareness teaching aid, assessment and guidelines. Okay, now let's look at a blog. Let's see, are there any blogs that talk about phonemic awareness? I'm gonna type, oh, it already popped up. Maybe what I've been searching. Okay, so we see a blog about phonological awareness, okay? And then let's look at events last. So events, you can come and see, okay, what's happening? This is today, right? Well, we're in right now, the Science Kickoff program, the Science of Reading Kickoff year-long journey plan. And then you see here, we have phonemic awareness for assessment of instruction. That's coming up September 22nd, which I hope that you will join us for. So I'm gonna hand back, because I'm looking at time, I'm gonna hand this right on back over and stop my share. So, so that we can show the PowerPoint again.
So just take a second in the chat, and if you can think of one main takeaway from today's session. We covered a lot of content, got really deep into some of the reading frameworks and deep reading brain. So just one takeaway from today's session. And right after we share our takeaways, we're going to go to a poll from today's session. All right, resources on Cox campus. We love to see that. The PEACE acronym for deep reading, things that we can focus on in preschool, knowing that those word recognition and listening comprehension pieces both can start from an early age. Human beings were never born to read. Resources, I love to see people loving those Cox campus resources. They're all free and all available. And then the poll should come up for you to respond for today's session.
I see Joe Ellen asked a question about resources in Spanish. There are some resources in Spanish that are tied to our Birth to 5 courses, and you can search Spanish in the chat. I know we have a resource that has some tier 2 vocabulary words in English and Spanish, and there will be some coming out with the oral language course, which will launch hopefully in January. Everybody, you can stay connected with us by joining our Facebook community, following us on Facebook and Twitter. We're even on LinkedIn. We would love to see everybody continue to engage in this conversation. This recording will be launched on our YouTube channel in a few days. And we hope to see everybody back on September 22nd. And that will be 3 p.m. Eastern time. I know there was some confusion there.